But one of your policies, at least, goes further than some on the stage with you are willing to go. You have called for the decriminalization of all drugs. Does that include heroin, meth, and cocaine, some of the drugs that have contributed to this crisis?
No, what I've called for is that incarceration should no longer be the response to drug possession.
With all due respect, Mayor Buttigieg, on your website it says that you called for decriminalization of all drugs.
Again, what I'm calling for is that we end the use of incarceration as a response. This does not mean that it will be lawful to produce or distribute those kinds of harmful drugs. But also, as we know from the opioid crisis, some of this has been driven by companies that were acting irresponsibly with substances that were lawful. It's why in South Bend we sued those companies to hold them accountable. We've got to make sure that there is accountability for those who suppressed evidence about the addictiveness of those substances, even while we're also coming to recognize that these kinds of addiction are a medical issue, not a moral failure on the part of somebody battling that addiction. That's why medication-assisted treatment is so important. And those people who are being revived, and our own EMTs in my city have been so frustrated by the experience of reviving somebody, but then they have nowhere to go. Sometimes you get brought back with a dose of Narcan, but then your life depends on whether in the days that follow you make it until somebody can actually see you, because we have such a shortage of mental health and addiction providers in this country. We must act to change that and save lives when we do.
I want to bring this question now to Mr. Yang. You've said you would decriminalize opioids, but you've also said that you would require all overdose patients to go to mandatory treatment centers for 3 days. Well, right now in New Hampshire, there aren't enough beds in treatment centers and across the country. How would you make sure treatment is available for all overdose patients? And what would you do to fill the gap in the meantime?
That's what we have to change, Monica. I've heard heartbreaking stories from families here in New Hampshire that have been destroyed, torn apart by the opiate epidemic. And you have to look at the companies that profited to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in profits of essentially blood money. As president, we will take back those profits and put them to work right here in New Hampshire so that if you are seeking treatment, you have resources to be able to pursue it. This is not a money problem fundamentally, this is a human problem, but money cannot be the obstacle. This is something that happened on the government's watch. The government allowed this opiate epidemic to spread throughout our communities, and we have to do everything in our power to actually make sure that if you're seeking treatment, you know you're not going to be sent to jail. We have safe injection and safe consumption sites for you. If you have a family member who's struggling, you can refer them and know that they're not going to have criminal penalties as a result. There is so much about this that's endemic to what's happened throughout the country in terms of companies running amok, this hyper-corporate capitalism where if money's on one side in this country and people are on the other side, the money is winning. You can see it with the opiate epidemic. You can see it with the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies. This is what we must change, and that's where I'll lead as president.
Senator Klobuchar, I want to take the question to you now. As a prosecutor, you embrace tough-on-crime policies, even with drug offenders. You've also spoken many times about your father's own addiction issues, his own alcoholism, and his DUI arrests. If addiction is a disease, should people be arrested for it? And as a prosecutor, do you regret sending people with substance abuse issues to jail?
I led one of the most successful drug courts in the country in Hennepin County. And I always would say and believed, and I think my record shows this, that we weren't a business. We didn't want to see repeat customers. And if you don't want to see repeat customers, the only answer is treatment. And maybe you're referring to some of the people who were dealing big time in drugs. Yes, I felt that we should prosecute those people. But when it comes to, and you asked Mr. Yang a question, and I think we owe it to the people of New Hampshire to have had one of the biggest addiction rates in the country and death rates when it comes to opioids, to explain how we will pay for the treatment and the beds. I've been very clear about this. There's going to be a major settlement coming through, a federal settlement against all these opioid manufacturers. The evidence is overwhelming, including an email where one guy, a business guy, says to the other, they're eating them like Doritos. Just keep pumping them out. We will get a conservative estimate, $40 billion in from that settlement. We can put a 2 cents per milligram tax on opioids that brings in another $40 billion. Then you can close the hedge fund loophole. That brings in $18 billion. And just like every other policy I've proposed, and I think New Hampshire voters should care about this, I have showed how I'm going to pay for it, because I think we have someone in the White House that has told over 15,000 lies. He makes all kinds of promises. The people of New Hampshire and the people of our country deserve better. I will get this done, and it is personal for me.
Good evening, candidates. New Hampshire is a battleground not just for presidential contenders, but also for top issues, and that includes gun policy. Senator Sanders, for many voters in this Democratic primary, your allure is about consistency. When it comes to progressive issues, you've been on the right side of them for a long time. One exception is gun rights. In the 90s, when you were in Congress, you voted against background checks, and you also voted against a waiting period for purchase of a firearm. Can you explain why you oppose these things that you now support?
I can, Adam, and let me also say that in 1988, I probably lost a race for Congress, and we only have one congressperson in the whole state. Because in 1988, I said that we should ban the sale and distribution of assault weapons in this country. That was 30 years ago. Furthermore, I am very proud that today I have a D- voting record from the NRA. And under my administration, it will be the American people doing gun policy, not dictated by the NRA. But to answer your question, I come, like New Hampshire, from a very, very rural state. In Vermont, until the last 2 years ago, we had virtually no gun control legislation at all, and I represented that perspective. The world has changed. In Vermont and in New Hampshire and all over this country, people are sickened by the mass shootings that we have seen and the gun violence that we have seen. The world has changed and my views have changed. And my view is right now, we need universal background checks. We end the gun show loophole. We end the so-called straw man provision. We make certain that we end the sale and distribution of assault weapons in this country. And we go further. We go further. But the bottom line is I will not be intimidated by the NRA. We're going to run the gun policy that the American people want.
Vice President Biden, you've taken a lot of heat in this primary on these debate stages and from voters here in New Hampshire for your past positions. You've essentially asked them to look at the totality of your record and give you the benefit of the doubt. Does Senator Sanders deserve that same benefit of the doubt on guns?
Well, look, here's the deal. The biggest mistake that Bernie made, that Senator Sanders made, he voted to give the gun manufacturers, the only major industry in America, a loophole that does not allow them to be sued for the carnage they are creating. First thing I'll do as president is work to get rid of that. It's going to be hard. Think of all the thousands and thousands of people who died. And I might add, Bernie, while you were representing your constituency, an awful lot of people that are a gun state, and they've come around. In fact, all those folks in California, New York, Pennsylvania, they were getting killed by the thousands during this same period. I come from a state that's a major gun-owning state. I introduced the first assault weapons ban. I, in fact, got it passed. I'm the only guy that beat the NRA twice. While I was pushing the Brady background background checks, Bernie voted 5 times against it when he was in the House. So look, the other thing is that when we have to be held accountable for the things we did. I'm the guy that set up drug courts. I set them up. I wrote it into law, and it never got funded. And also on opioids, I'm the guy who's already begun to make a down payment. In the Cures Act, I put in $1 billion to fight opioid addiction. And lastly, my time is going to be up shortly. Here's the deal. Those chief executive officers of those drug companies, they should not only be fined, they should go to jail.
Senator Warren, we'd like to go to you now.
Yeah.
Plans count for a lot. I want to ask you this question here, though. Laws can do so much. If you could change one thing about America's gun culture, what would it be?
Look, we have a gun violence problem in America. It is about the mass shootings that we hear about in our schools and that frighten us, about in theaters and in churches. It's also, though, about shootings that occur on sidewalks and in playgrounds, often in communities of color that are hit hardest. But there are no headlines over those. It's also about suicide and the increased lethality of suicide because of the availability of guns. It is also about the increased chances that it's usually a woman will die of domestic violence if she is with a violent man and a gun is in the home. We need to think of this problem not as one and done or 3 things and done. We need to think of it just like we did on auto safety. We just keep coming back. We treat it like the public health emergency that it is. But the question we should be asking ourselves is when America across this country, including gun owners, agree in certain basic things, universal background checks, get assault weapons off the streets, why can we not even get a vote in the United States Senate? And the answer is 90%. Think about this. More than 90% of Americans agree on this. We can't get a vote in the United States Senate because it is the gun industry that continues to call the shots. Until we attack the corruption in Washington, the influence of money on campaigns and lobbying, we're not going to be able to meet our promises. And one more, until we agree that we are willing to roll back the filibuster, the gun industry is going to continue to have a veto, and we will never make the changes we make. We have to be willing to build a future that works not for a gun industry, but that works for the rest of America and protects our children.
You've got to be able to sue the gun industry.
Thank you, candidates. We're going to go back to David up there at the home.
Adam, Monica, thank you, and thanks to WMUR tonight. I want to turn to the Supreme Court, the balance on the court, and the issues before the court right now. President Trump, in just the last 24 hours, saying we've appointed 191 federal judges, 2 Supreme Court justices, keeping his campaign promise to shift the court to the right with Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. The Affordable Care Act is at the court, climate change is working its way to the court, and a major abortion case is on the docket this year. Vice President Biden, on the issue of abortion, in 2012, you said President Obama's 2 Supreme Court picks, of them, there was no litmus test. We picked people who had an open mind, did not come with an agenda. And you've said before, we both believe that we should not apply narrow litmus tests to appointees to the Supreme Court.
But I also
let me just ask, would you do it differently as president, Mr. Vice President? Would there be a litmus test on abortion?
If you say the rest of what I said that we're going to not appoint anyone who did not have a view that unenumerated rights existed in the Constitution. That's not a specific test. It's a generic test. And the only reason women have the right to choose is because it's determined that there's unenumerated rights coming from the 9th Amendment in the Constitution. That's what I said. And I was part of the reason why Elena Kagan, who worked for me, got on the Supreme Court. I was part of the reason why Ruth Bader Ginsburg is on the court. I was part of the reason why Sotomayor is on the court, and she swore me in. I presided, and I'm the reason why this right wasn't taken away a long time ago, because I almost single-handedly made sure that Robert Bork did not get on the court because he did not think there should be enumerated rights. Unenumerated.
So let me just drill down.
Let's get that straight.
Mr. Vice President, I am aware of what you said, which is why I'm asking, would you do it differently now? Would there be a litmus test on abortion?
Yes, look, here's the deal. The litmus test on abortion relates to the fundamental value in the Constitution. A woman does have a right to choose. I would, in fact, if they rule it to be unconstitutional, I will send to the United States Congress, and it will pass, I believe, a bill that legislates Roe v. Wade adjusted by Casey. It's a woman's right to do that, period. And if you call that a litmus test, it's a litmus test. But what I was talking about in the past, so no one gets confused here, is if you read the Constitution very, very narrowly and say there are no unenumerated rights, if it doesn't say it in the Constitution, it doesn't exist. You cannot have any of the things I care about. Any of the things I care about as a progressive member of the United States Congress at the time, and as Vice President, and as a member of society.
Mr. Vice President, thank you. Senator Warren?
Look, I've lived in an America in which abortion was illegal, and rich women still got abortions. And that's what we have to remember about this. States are heading toward trying to ban abortion outright, and the Supreme Court seems headed in exactly that direction as well. If we are going to protect the people of the United States of America, and we are going to protect our rights to have dominion over our own bodies, then it's going to mean we can't simply rely on the courts. 3 out of every 4 people in America believe right now that the rule of Roe versus Wade should be the law. That means we should be pushing for a congressional solution as well. It is time to have a national law to protect the right of a woman's choice.
Senator Warren, thank you. Senator Klobuchar, I do want to come to you. Should there be a litmus test? It's an active hall here tonight. I did want to come to you on this question as well.
Thank you.
Should there be a litmus test on abortion?
I would only appoint judges that would respect precedent, and one of those key precedents is Roe v. Wade. In addition, you have got to put it into law. Donald Trump, and I think it's really important to take it to him here, when he was running for election, and this is a case I will make on the debate stage against him, he actually said that he wanted to put women in jail. He then dialed it back and said, no, I want to put doctors in jail. Is it a big surprise then we're seeing states like Alabama start enacting laws that would criminalize doctors who perform abortions? It's not. And that is why it's going to be really important when you look at the overwhelming public support for funding Planned Parenthood, for making sure women have access to contraceptions, to making sure that they have a right to choose, that we make this case strongly and loudly.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you. Mayor Buttigieg Judge, you have signaled that you'd be open to the idea of expanding the court. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had suggested leaving the court as it is, saying, quote, 9 seems to be a good number. And in fact, she said if the number of justices is increased, quote, it would make the court appear partisan. It would be one side saying, when we're in power, we're going to enlarge the number of judges to have more people who will vote the way we want them to. Is Justice Ginsburg wrong?
Well, if all we did was change the number of justices, then I agree with her that that could be the consequence. What I've called for is not only reforming the number of justices on the bench, but structural reform so that some of the justices are not appointed through a partisan process. We cannot allow the Supreme Court to continue to become one more political battlefield as we are seeing today. And the time has come for us to think bigger, not just reforming the makeup of the court, as America, by the way, has done several times in our history, but also remember that the founders gave us the power to amend the Constitution for a reason, and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. It's not something you do lightly or quickly, but when it comes to something like Citizens United, which holds that corporations have the same political soul as people, and that spending money to influence an election is the same thing as writing an op-ed to your local paper, we need a constitutional amendment to clear that up and protect our democracy.
Mayor Buttigieg, thank you. Vice President Biden, I do want to come to you on this. President Trump has said that the only reason Democrats want to expand the court is they want to try and catch up. You have called any expansion of the court a bad idea, adding, we will live to rue that day. Do you agree with President Trump on that?
I agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's who I agree with. And I agree the way to deal with Citizens United is pass a constitutional amendment I introduced 25 years ago saying that only public money can be spent in elections, period. Not private money, not billionaires, not money from special interests, period. That's the way to amend the Constitution to deal with that. In addition to that, if in fact, look, the Democrats stood up against the man I revere, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wanted to expand the court. But they were wise enough to understand that whoever then is the majority will have the ability to abuse it, and it will lose its legitimacy. And there are 3 equal branches of government. It says the president shall nominate. The Senate shall dispose. The Senate shall make that decision, not the president. He can nominate. That's why it's so important. We must win back the United States Senate this time out. And that's why, as you all look at it up here in New Hampshire and around the world, around the country, you have to ask yourself, who is most likely to help get a senator elected in North Carolina, Georgia? Who can win Florida, Pennsylvania, Minnesota? Who can do that? Because you got to be able to win those. Well, you can. I agree. But here's the point. You've got to be able to. You've got to be able to not just win, you've got to bring along a United States Senate, or this becomes moot.
Okay.
Senator Sanders.
Thank you. Look, you asked a simple question. Is there a litmus test for those of us up here? For me, there is. I will never nominate any person to the Supreme Court or the federal courts in general who is not 100% pro Roe v. Wade. Number 2, we have got to codify Roe v. Wade into legislation. Number 3, we have to significantly expand funding for Planned Parenthood.
Mr. Steyer, I want to bring you in on this because you have claimed that when it comes to the Supreme Court, you have said Republicans have been cheating.
Sure, they've been cheating. Look, what we saw Mitch McConnell do, not just in the Supreme Court with Merrick Garland, but across the board with federal judges, was refuse to allow President Obama's picks to be considered. That's why Mr. Trump has appointed so many federal judges, because in fact, the Republicans refuse to allow President Obama to get his due. And honestly, we're sitting here talking about, do you have a litmus test? We all have the litmus test. Everybody on this row feels exactly the same way about a woman's right to choose. Everybody on this row feels exactly the same way on gun control. Every single one in this row feels the same way. There's something else going on. These Republicans are in control. They're stacking the court for a generation with young right-wing radicals. And we've watched it happen, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? That's where we are in the United States. And the question is, actually, Joe Biden's right. We have to go win a huge victory this year. And we're in trouble. And so the question is going to be, look at these people. Who can pull together the Democratic Party? And let me say this. We have not said one word tonight about race. Not one word. Are you kidding me? We have the most diverse party. We have a very diverse country. We have a very diverse party. The heart and soul of this party is diversity, black people, Latinos, AAPI people, Native Americans, and white people. But for goodness sakes, pull it together. We're talking about something different. The question we have is, how are we getting that diverse group of people to the polls? What are we saying? Everybody on this stage feels the same way about a woman's right to choose and economic justice. The question is, how do we beat Trump? How do we take down these Republicans? And the answer is, we've got to show we can take them down on growth, job creation, the economy. We send them packing, and then we get all of this, including beating the corporation.
Mr. Steyer, thank you. The night is still young. Many questions to come, and Lindsay Davis is next.
I want to turn now to criminal justice. Mayor Buttigieg, under your leadership as mayor, a black resident in South Bend, Indiana, was 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white resident. Now, that racial disparity is higher than the rest of the state. In fact, it's higher than the rest of the nation, and that disparity increased in South Bend after you took office. When talking about the problem on national terms, you've called it, quote, evidence of systemic racism. But you were mayor for 8 years, so weren't you, in effect, the head of the system? And how do you explain that increase in black arrests under your leadership?
Well, the reality is, on my watch, drug arrests in South Bend were lower than the national average, and specifically to marijuana, lower than in Indiana. But there is no question that systemic racism has penetrated to every level of our system, and my city was not immune. I took a lot of heat for discussing systemic racism with my own police department, but we've got to confront the fact that there is no escaping how this is part of all of our policies. Earlier, we were talking about opioids, and thankfully, America has come to a better understanding about the fact that opioid addiction is best understood as a medical problem. But there were a lot of people, including a lot of African-American activists in my community, who have made the very good point. It's great that everybody's so enlightened about drug policy now when it comes to opioids, but where were you when it came to marijuana? Where were you when it came to the crack epidemic in the 1990s? That is one of the reasons why I am calling for us as a country to take up those reforms that end incarceration as a response to possession and make sure that we legalize marijuana, and when we do it retroactively with expungements to correct the harm done in so many cases of incarceration, disproportionately of black and brown Americans, where the incarceration did far more harm than the offense it was intended to deal with.
I want to go back to the original question, though. How do you explain the increase in black arrests in South Bend under your leadership for marijuana possession?
And again, the overall rate was lower.
No, there was an increase. The year before you were in office, it was lower. Once you became in office in 2012, that number went up. In 2018, the last year that we have a record for, that number was still up.
Yeah. And one of the strategies that our community adopted was to target when there were cases where there was gun violence and gang violence, which was slaughtering so many in our community. Burying teenagers, disproportionately black teenagers. We adopted a strategy that said that drug enforcement would be targeted in cases where there was a connection to the most violent group or gang connected to a murder. These things are all connected, but that's the point. So are all of the things that need to change in order for us to prevent violence and remove the effects of systemic racism, not just from criminal justice, but from our economy, from health, from housing, and from our democracy itself.
Senator Warren, is that a substantial answer from Mayor Buttigieg?
No. You have to own up to the facts. And it's important to own up to the facts about how race has totally permeated our criminal justice system. You know, for the exact same crime, study after study now shows that African Americans are more likely than whites to be detained, to be arrested, to be taken to trial, to be wrongfully convicted, and to receive harsher sentences. We need to rework our criminal justice system from the very front end on what we make illegal all the the way through the system and how we help people come back into the community. But we cannot just say that criminal justice is the only time we want to talk about race specifically. We need to start having race-conscious laws. Housing, for example. I have a great housing plan to build more housing in America, but understand, it was the policy of the United States of America to discriminate against African Americans and people, any other people of color, for buying homes until 1965. You can't just repeal that and say, okay, now everything is even. It's not. We need race-conscious laws in education, in employment, in entrepreneurship, to make this country a country of opportunity for everyone, no matter the color of their skin.
Elizabeth, with respect, with respect, you can't regulate away racism with a whole patchwork of laws that are race-specific. What we have to do is heed the writings of Martin Luther King, whose birthday we just celebrated. He said that capitalism forgets that life is social, and what he was championing was a guaranteed minimum income for all Americans of $1,000 a month or more that would end up reshaping our economy in communities of color, make it so that black net worth is not 10% of white net worth in this country, which is the most important number of them all. We can't regulate that away through any other means except by putting money directly into the hands of African Americans and Latinos and people of color to allow businesses to actually flourish and grow in those communities. The only way that will happen is if Black and Latino consumers have buying power, and that is where we have to move as a country.
Senator Sanders, then Mr. Steyer.
Andrew, no, let me say this. I disagree with you, Andrew. I am the person on this stage who will say openly, I'm for reparations. Something wrong happened. I am for reparations to African Americans in this country, and anyone who thinks that racism is a thing of the past and not an ongoing problem is not dealing with reality. In fact, 3 days ago, one of the leaders of Joe Biden's South Carolina campaign made racist remarks about someone associated with our campaign. And the Legislative Black Caucus went out en masse to stand up for that man and for our campaign. Joe, I'm asking you to come with me and the Legislative Black Caucus and disavow Dick Harpootlian and what he had to say. It was wrong. And I'm asking you to join us, be on the right side.
I'm asking you to join me and join in the support I have from the overwhelming number of the members of that Black Caucus. I have more support in South Carolina in the Black Caucus and the Black community than anybody else. Double what you have or anybody else has.
But wait a second, Bernie.
Well, that is quite right.
Let's not argue about polls.
That is correct.
This isn't about Bernie.
Senator
This isn't
Sanders.
about polls.
I'm not
This is not about polls.
I'm not talking about polls.
We have 9 members of the Black Caucus in South Carolina supporting us. But more importantly, much of what Elizabeth said is absolutely correct. We have a racist society from top to bottom, impacting health care, housing, criminal justice, education, you name it. And clearly this is an issue that must be dealt with. But in terms of criminal justice, what we have got to do is understand the system is broken, is racist. We invest in our young people in jobs and education, not more jails and incarceration. We end the war on drugs, which has disproportionately impacted African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. We end private prisons and detention centers in America.
Bernie, I appreciate what you're saying.
And, excuse me, we also, most people don't know this, tonight in America, 200,000 people are in jail without having been convicted of anything.
That's right.
200,000 people, because they can't afford the $500 for bail they need to get out of jail. That is outrageous. We're going to end cash bail.
Okay, let me say this. I've worked to end cash bail in California, and it's gone. I've worked to end private prisons in California, and they're gone. I'm somebody our family, my wife and I, started a bank specifically to support businesses owned by women, Black people, and Latinos because they couldn't get financing anywhere else. But Joe, I want to answer. Really, I think you should come over and disavow the statements that this man made that were openly racist, that were wrong, and the Legislative Black Caucus is against. I'm asking you to join us and do the right thing.
I've already spoken to Dick Harpootlian, and he, in fact, is, I believe, sorry for what he said. But here's the deal, folks. Look, we got to stop taking the black community for granted. That's the starting place. Every one of the things we talked about here, for example, in South Carolina, Jim Clyburn, he has a program, it's 10, 15, 30. We should be investing our money in those communities that haven't gotten help for a long time and give most of that help to those communities. Make it a priority. We should make sure that we have no one going to jail for a drug offense. They go directly mandatory mandatory treatment, not prison. And we fund it. And we fund it, and 3 days doesn't get it. It takes at least 60 to 90 days to make any progress. We have to pay for that. Just like instead of building new prisons, we build new rehabilitation centers. We have to make sure that we have a window at the Treasury Department that allows entrepreneurs who are black and brown and minorities to be able to get loans to be able to start businesses. You know, if you own a house, I know you do know, if you own a house in an all-black neighborhood, same exact house in an all-white neighborhood, exact same shape, the house valued in the black neighborhood would be valued as worth less, making it difficult for you to accumulate wealth, as my friend at the end of the line here says. So here's the deal. We have to do much, much more. That's what got me involved in politics in the first place, redlining, to stop it. I got involved through the civil rights movement. I became a public defender. That's why I got involved. There's so many things we have to do across the board, and in education. At-risk schools. We should triple the funding we have for at-risk schools to provide for 4, 5, and 6 years old to be able to go, 3, 4, and 5 years old to go to school, not daycare. Increase the salaries of teachers. Encourage more blacks to get into teaching, especially black men, because the studies show when there's a black man in a community, in a school, it increases prospects significantly, and so on. There's a lot we can do. I've laid it all out as how to do it. Go to joebiden.com. You'll see the whole deal, including criminal justice reform.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. As you mentioned, South Carolina, 3 weeks from tomorrow, they'll go to the polls to vote. Black voters make up about 60% of the electorate there. Senator Sanders, several weeks ago, Nina Turner, one of your national co-chairs, published an op-ed piece that said Vice President Biden has, quote, repeatedly betrayed black voters to side with Republican lawmakers and undermine our progress. Senator Sanders, do you agree with her? One of your most visible surrogates that Vice President Biden has repeatedly betrayed black voters?
Well, I think what Senator Turner was talking about are some of the early actions of Vice President Biden. But no, Joe Biden is a friend of mine, and I'm not here to attack him. But what I would say is that what we need in terms of the African-American community is to understand that we have got to start investing big time in education, in healthcare. There is no excuse why white families in America have 10 times more wealth than black families. No excuse that disproportionately African Americans are in jail compared to whites. No excuse for black women dying in childbirth 3 times the rate that white women are doing as well.
Senator Klobuchar. You had raised your hand before.
Yes, I did, because I think in addition to the economic argument we're making here with the sad stories of a woman walking into a maternity room in New Orleans and saying her hands are swollen and walking out without her baby, and 30% of African-American kids living in poverty. We know that there are economic solutions here to invest in those communities, housing, childcare. But there's something else insidious going on that we haven't addressed, and that is the systematic racism when it comes to voting. That is moves across the country to limit people's right to vote. And that is why I have been leading on these bills to automatically register every kid to vote in this country when they turn 18. There is no reason that we can't do that across this country. To stop the gerrymandering by setting up independent commissions in every single state. And yes, to stop the voting purges. Because what is going on right now, in the words of one North Carolina court, is that they are discriminating with surgical precision against African American voters. And we are not going to be able to get any of these things done if we don't give people the right to vote.
Vice President Biden and then Senator Warren.
I beg your pardon?
I just wanted to give you a chance to respond.
Yes, I agree completely. There should be registration, automatic registration turning 18. You get a driver's license, whatever you do, you automatically are registered, number one. Number two, with regard to what we're going to see in South Carolina, we're all going to be there pretty soon. We'll see whether or not it works. The response to the letter that the person, I'm not saying Bernie wrote the letter, but the senator wrote the letter, was very brisk and significant, with other African Americans in South Carolina taking issue with her. But look, Amy is right. The senator is correct. That is that we, in fact, there is systematic racism. And that's why our Justice Department works so hard to go after those. You know, realize there are 35 states in the United States of America that have come up with a total of 78 laws to restrict voting just in the last 5 years to try to keep African Americans from voting, and brown as well, black and brown people from voting. And that will be an enormous priority in my administration, as it was in ours. It's just wrong, simply wrong.
Senator Warren.
You know, I'm glad to stand on this stage with my fellow Democrats who talk about how important the black community is, at least at election time. Year after year after year, election after election after election, Democrats go to people in the black community and say, boy, we really care about these issues. Racism is terrible. We all want to do something. And then somehow the problem just seems to keep getting worse. Well, I think it's time we have real concrete plans that are going to make a difference in people's lives. I proposed a 2-cent wealth tax. And let me tell you just one of the things we can do with a 2-cent wealth tax. We can cancel student loan debt for 43 million Americans. And because African Americans have to borrow more money to go to college, borrow more money while they're in college, and have a harder time paying it back when they get out, that one law is going to help close the black-white wealth gap for people with student loans by about 20 points. We aren't making a difference in America. We're saying to the rich folks, you keep your money, and the rest of us will talk about racism, but not really do anything. I think the time for that is over. I'm ready to get in this fight and really make a change.
George. Okay, thank you. Actually, let's keep this debate going. Go ahead, Mr. Steyer.
Look, out of narrative comes policy. And we're talking about a lot of policies that affect Americans broadly and disproportionately affect black Americans or brown Americans. But what I believe is we should set up a commission on race and deal with race explicitly. Because everyone's saying we can't have rules that are different for different people. But in fact, we're here because we had rules that are different for different people. I would set up a formal commission on race on day one to retell the story of the last 400 years in America of systematic racism against African Americans, not just legal discrimination, injustice, and cruelty, but also the contribution that the African American community has made to America in building it and in leading the entire country from a moral standpoint for generations and centuries. Because I believe out of narrative comes policy. We need to repair damage that's been done officially, and pretending we're all the same is not accurate. We got here a certain way. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Let's talk about Martin Luther King. Let's talk about Barbara Lee, the congresswoman from Oakland, who's one of our great leaders, and then let's figure out how to repair the damage so we can move forward together.
Mr. Yang, take on that argument and also what he said about reparations.
The median African-American household net worth is projected to be 0 by 2053. Things are not getting better for people of color. If anything, they're getting worse because we're in the process of eliminating the most common jobs in our economy. It's something of an economic unnatural disaster. And who suffers most in a natural disaster? People of color, people with lower levels of capital and access to opportunity and education. And while I know we love to champion education here as Democrats, only 33% of Americans are going to attend college. Lower percentage of African Americans. There is no way we can prevent this tsunami from wiping out African American net worth unless we put straight cash into their hands sometime between now and 2053. And it's not just just them. It is truck drivers, it is retail clerks, it is call center workers, it is accountants, it is bookkeepers. We are in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country, and it's going to hit black people the hardest. We have to stop nibbling at the edges and actually start solving the real problem.
We've been getting a lot of questions. We've been getting a lot of questions from Apple News and tonight, including many about a candidate who's not on the stage tonight, but it is in this race, and that is former Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York. And this question came in from Nashville, Tennessee. It says, billionaire Michael Bloomberg has entered the race and just got the endorsement of a former Trump Navy secretary. Why do you think you are better positioned than Bloomberg to beat Trump? Senator Warren.
Look, I don't think anyone ought to be able to buy their way into a nomination or to be president of the United States. I don't think any billionaire ought to be able to do it, and I don't think people who suck up to billionaires in order to fund their campaigns ought to do it. I heard everyone here talking about, as Democrats, we all want to overturn Citizens United because we want to end this unlimited spending. Yeah, except everyone on this stage, except Amy and me, is either a billionaire or is receiving help from PACs that can do unlimited spending. So if you really want to live where you say, then put your money where your mouth is and say no to the PACs. Look, I think the way we build a democracy going forward is not billionaires reaching in their own pockets or people sucking up to billionaires. The way we build it going forward is we have a grassroots movement funded from the grassroots up. That's the way I'm running this campaign. If you think it's the right way to run a campaign, go to ElizabethWarren.com and pitch in $5, because understand this. Our democracy hangs in the balance. If we have to fund through billionaires, then we're just going to be in America that's going to work better and better for billionaires and not for anyone else.
So I can't stand the big money in politics. And one of my major focuses is going to be on passing that constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. I didn't come from money. And I just simply think people don't look at the guy in the White House and say, can we get someone richer? I don't think they think that. They want to have someone that they can understand. And you know my background. My grandpa was an iron ore miner. He worked 1,500 feet underground in the mines his whole life. He couldn't even graduate from high school because he had to raise his 9 brothers and sisters. My grandpa saved money in a coffee can to send my dad to a 2-year community college. That was my family's trust. And you can't send, like Donald Trump got from his family, you can't fit $413 million in a coffee can. My mom grew up as and wanted to be a teacher in Wisconsin. She moved to Minnesota. She taught 2nd grade until she was 70 years old. And no, I am not a billionaire, but I stand before you today as the granddaughter of an iron ore miner, the daughter of a teacher and a newspaperman, the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from the state of Minnesota, someone who has passed over 100 bills as the lead Democrat in that gridlock in Washington, D.C. And that is because we live in a country of shared dreams. And that means no matter where you come from, you should be able to make it. So please help me in my efforts at amyklobuchar.com.
Everybody's getting the fundraising pitches out here right now. Senator Sanders, I am coming to you, but Mayor Bloomberg let me just put the question to you, because Mayor Bloomberg has taken on your argument. I got an answer
before the question. It's more.
He says we need evolution, not revolution.
Can you hear that?
Mayor Bloomberg has said we need evolution, not revolution, taking you on directly.
Well, it's a funny thing. There are millions of people who can desire to run for office. But I guess if you're worth $60 billion and you could spend several $100 million on commercials, you have a slight advantage. That is nonsense. What we have got to do is have a nation in which we not only overturn Citizens United, we move to public funding of elections. In terms of money in politics, all right? Our campaign, and I am enormously proud of this, unlike some of the folks up here, I don't have 40 billionaires, Pete, contributing to my campaign, coming from the pharmaceutical industry, coming from Wall Street and all the big money interests. What we do have is we have now over 6 million contributions from 1.5 million people averaging $18.50 a contribution. That is unprecedented in the history of American politics. If we want to change America, you're not going to do it by electing candidates who are going out to rich people's homes begging for money. The way we're going to do it is build a mass movement of working people who are prepared to stand up, not take money from these billionaires, not take money from Wall Street, but stand up to the drug companies in Wall Street. And if you want to be part of that political revolution, BernieSanders.com.
Mayor Buttigieg, close this round out.
We are going into the fight of our lives. Donald Trump, according to news reports, and his allies raised $25 million today. We need to go into that fight with everything that we've got. Now, I've been very clear on both my record, where I have sued pharmaceutical companies, and what I'm campaigning for, that includes raising wages and raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy. And as the only person on this stage who is not a millionaire or a billionaire, I know a thing or two about building a movement, because mayor of South Bend, Indiana is not exactly an establishment fundraising powerhouse. We are here without the involvement of any corporate PACs, because hundreds of thousands of people went to, yes, PeteForAmerica.com, contributed to this campaign. And let me say something else. If we want to bring about any of the changes that everyone is talking about so elegantly up here, we need to put together the majority that can decisively defeat Donald Trump. And in order to do that, we need a politics that is defined not by who we reject, but how we bring everybody into the fold. And if you are low income, or if you're able to contribute a lot, if you've always voted Democrat, or if you're an independent or even a Republican who's just sick of looking your kids in the eye and trying to explain this White House, we need you to join us right now. I will not pursue politics by telling people they can't be at our side if they're not with us 100% of the time. This is a time for addition, not rejection, for belonging, not exclusion.
Mayor Buttigieg, thank you. I want to turn to climate change and jobs here in America. President Trump just signed the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. Many call it an updated NAFTA. But it does include incentives to make cars here in North America, and it does open Canadian markets for American dairy farmers. Senator Sanders, as we sit here in New Hampshire tonight, both New Hampshire Senators Maggie Hassan and Senator Jeanne Shaheen supported this. They voted yes, calling it a real win for workers and for farmers. You voted no because you said you believe it takes us back years on climate. Were the senators from New Hampshire wrong?
Yes. I mean, it's a disagreement. But if you look at every environmental group in this country, including the Sunrise Organization, we're so proud to have their support, because we have introduced the most comprehensive climate change proposal I think ever offered by a presidential candidate. What they are saying, what the environmental groups are saying, we're simply exporting fossil fuel emissions to Mexico. There is not one word in that trade agreement that deals with climate change. And I don't know how in 2020 you can do that. Second of all, there is, in terms of outsourcing of jobs, a major crisis in this country. Nobody believes that under this Trump trade agreement that there will not be continued and significant outsourcing of jobs into low-wage Mexico, where workers are paid, in some cases, less than $2 an hour. So I think the right vote was to vote against that agreement. I don't apologize for that.
Senator Sanders, thank you. I do want to go to Senator Klobuchar. You heard what Senator Sanders just said there. He said not one word on climate in the trade deal. So why did you vote yes?
Well, first of all, I want to defend the honor of the incredible two senators from New Hampshire, Jeanne Shaheen and Maggie Hassan. who work so hard for this state every day, and I voted with them. Why did I vote with them? Because there were some major improvements in this trade agreement when it comes to labor inspections, when it comes to getting rid of a sweetheart pharma deal that was in place. And when it comes to climate change, I think we have to have a North American trading bloc. We have to have Mexico and Canada and America working together. And the best way to take on climate change, as president, yes, I'll work to make this a part of every future trade agreement, but the best way to take on climate change is by getting back into the International Climate Change Agreement, which I will do on day one. It is bringing back the clean power rules. It is bringing back the gas mileage standards, and it is introducing sweeping legislation to put a price on carbon. And you cannot divorce trade from that, and in future trade agreements, that should be part of our negotiations. But I'm telling you right now, having no trade agreement with Canada and Mexico puts us at such a disadvantage when it comes to dealing with China and pushing China to do better when it comes to climate change.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you. Senator Warren, you voted yes as well.
Yes, I did, and I'll tell you why. Because there are a lot of farmers around this country that are really hurting because of Donald Trump's trade policies. There are a lot of workers who are hurting because they can't get enforcement of any workers' rights. So this NAFTA provision, after a lot of negotiation with Democrats, Senator Sherrod Brown helped make it a whole lot better. This makes things somewhat better for workers and for farmers. And when I see a law that makes things somewhat better for hardworking people in this country, I say I'll sign up for that, and then I'll get up tomorrow morning and I'll start working hard for a better trade deal on climate, a better trade deal that has a basic coherence to it. Everyone wants to get to the American market. We should be raising standards on climate around the world to get access to our market.
Mr. Steyer.
Yeah, I mean, I got to agree with Bernie Sanders. And I got to, I do. Senator Warren is right. Everybody wants to get into our market. And that's how we convince them that they've got to be right on climate too. That we have to stop making foreign policy decisions in the old way. Yeah, of course we want to make things better for American workers. And it's absolutely critical that when we think about trade policy, we're thinking about it from the point of view of the American people, not of the American corporations. That's a huge positive change, and I agree with the senators on that. But there's something else going on here when we think about our foreign policy, and that's this. We talked about whether it was right to kill General Soleimani. And there was no discussion in that about where that leaves the United States in the community of nations around the world. So if we actually want to be the leaders of the world, the leaders of the free world, who can actually negotiate a climate treaty around the world that sticks, that makes a difference, we're going to have to put climate first. And when we think about doing the wrong thing the way Mr. Trump did with General Soleimani, we have to ask, does that help us build a coalition of countries around the world to do the right thing? It absolutely does not. Being all by ourselves, being the empire in the Star Wars movie, does not put us in a position to get done what we need to get done as the leader of the free world. And so, in fact, the USMCA is something that's the first step, but the second step is exactly what Bernie Sanders is saying. Use access to our market as a negotiating thing to make sure not only that we represent American workers, but that we represent the American people in the long run, and we make sure that we get a safe climate deal.
One of the things about being in the arena is you have to make decisions all the time.
Yes.
And these things aren't always exactly how you would do them. But in this case, if you want to criticize Trump for not ever having any friends, and I would agree, he always sides with tyrants over innocents. He always sides with dictators over allies. But I think you've got to have some friends. And those two countries, our neighbors, may not be perfect, but they are our friends. And we have a president that literally blames everyone in the world, and we have not talked about this enough. He blames Barack Obama for everything that goes wrong. He blames his Federal Reserve chair that he appointed himself. He blames the King of Denmark. Who does that? He blames the Prime Minister of Canada for, he claims, cutting him out of the Canadian version of Home Alone 2. Who does that? That's what Donald Trump does. So my point here is that when we have opportunities to work with our allies, and New Hampshire is such a great example of this. New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire with senators like Jean Shaheen and Maggie Hassan, who believe we need to work with NATO and the rest of the world, who sees it as a smaller state, but a state that is a piece of the world. We cannot be alone. And that trade agreement was not perfect. But the point of it is, if we start isolating ourselves from the rest of the world, we are going to hurt ourselves economically, and we are going to hurt our nation's security.
All right, Senator Klobuchar, thanks very much.
We have hit the 2-hour mark. We're going to take a quick break and come back with a final question.
And welcome back to Manchester, New Hampshire, and the ABC News Democratic debate. Thanks for joining us here on ABC News Live tonight. I'm Devin Dwyer, joined with our political correspondent, Rachel Scott. Rachel, we heard so much this last block about gun policy, abortion, climate change, and then the issue of race, pushed on by Tom Steyer, and really a lot of the candidates confronting Joe Biden, a sign of where this campaign is headed.